Mid-1944. The world was at war. The Allies had invaded Normandy, France, and the Western Front was heating up. On June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion began, marking a significant turn in the war. For the United States, the timing couldn't have been more crucial. The M4 Sherman tank, a symbol of American military power, had started to roll out of factories in large numbers, a decisive shift that would change the course of the war. The Germans, caught off guard by the sheer scale of the American effort, now had to face a new enemy. It wasn't just the tanks themselves that posed a challenge. It was the speed at which the Americans were producing them. They couldn't destroy them fast enough. The Sherman tank had been in production since 1942, but by 1944, its numbers were steadily climbing. Designed to be mass-produced, it was far from the most advanced tank on the battlefield. The Sherman was smaller and lighter than its German counterparts, like the Tiger and Panther tanks, both of which had superior armor and firepower. The Sherman, with its relatively thin armor, could be knocked out easily by a well-placed shot from the larger German tanks. Its 75mm gun was also less powerful compared to the 88mm gun mounted on the German tanks. But where the Sherman excelled was in numbers. It was easier to produce, repair, and maintain than its German rivals. The Americans didn't just build these tanks to be effective in combat. They built them with speed in mind. The Sherman could be mass-produced in the US at an astonishing rate. Factories churned out thousands of these tanks, far faster than the Germans could build their heavy tanks. For every one of their Tigers and Panthers, the Germans saw dozens of Shermans roll off the assembly line. It was a race they couldn't win. By the time German forces destroyed one Sherman, another one was already on its way to the front lines. The German military had underestimated the scale of American production. In the early years of the war, Germany had focused on building tanks that were powerful and technologically advanced. The Tiger I and Panther were formidable machines, but they were also complex and slow to produce. Germany's war economy couldn't keep up with the pace of their own tank production, and the high cost of these heavy tanks made them hard to replace once destroyed. In Normandy, the Germans quickly realized that their tanks, while powerful, were outnumbered. The Sherman tanks, though less impressive individually, were overwhelming when in large numbers. German tank crews, used to facing small numbers of enemy tanks, found themselves surrounded by a sea of Shermans. Tactics they once relied on, like picking off enemy tanks from a distance with their superior guns, were no longer as effective. The Americans learned quickly that with enough Shermans, they could overpower their enemies through sheer weight of numbers. The American advantage wasn't just in numbers, it was also in logistics. While the Germans struggled with supply lines, the Americans had streamlined their operations. Sherman tanks could be repaired quickly in the field, and the parts were easy to replace. This meant that when a Sherman was knocked out, it didn't take long for it to be back in action. The German tanks, on the other hand, were more difficult to repair. The Germans had to rely on specialized crews to fix their tanks, and the process could take much longer. As a result, the German tanks spent more time out of action, giving the Allies an edge. German soldiers on the front line felt the weight of this new reality. They were well-trained and disciplined, but they had never faced such a relentless enemy. They could destroy Sherman tanks, but it didn't matter. The next wave was always coming. Frustration set in as German tank crews realized that even if they destroyed a dozen Shermans, they wouldn't stop the American advance. It was as if the US had an endless supply of tanks, pouring into France, flooding the battlefield with their presence. The Germans were forced to change their tactics. They began using anti-tank guns and infantry with anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust. These weapons were effective at close range, but they couldn't match the speed of the Americans. The Shermans kept coming, often supported by infantry and artillery, making it hard for the Germans to hold any ground for long. German tank crews, once able to fight with the confidence of superior technology, now found themselves on the defensive, trying to survive rather than win. As the war dragged on, the Americans' ability to replace their tanks became a significant factor in the conflict. For every Sherman the Germans destroyed, another one appeared. On the other hand, when a German tank was destroyed, it could take weeks or even months to replace. the imbalance became apparent. The Germans simply couldn't keep up with the pace of the Allied advance. It wasn't just the tanks themselves that created a problem for the Germans. It was the broader effect of American production and logistics. The Allies could send in wave after wave of tanks, trucks, and supplies, while the Germans found themselves struggling with equipment shortages and dwindling manpower. The Germans had a few pockets of resistance, but overall, their ability to fight back diminished as the Allies advanced further into France and beyond. The German high command knew that they couldn't win a war of attrition against the Americans. They had tried to rely on their elite tanks, hoping to inflict enough damage to slow down the Allied advance. But it became clear that no matter how many Tiger tanks they destroyed, the Allies would simply replace them with more Shermans. The speed and efficiency of American production had tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. The Sherman tank, despite its flaws, became a symbol of American industrial power. It wasn't the strongest or most advanced tank on the battlefield, but it didn't need to be. It was a tank that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and replaced without delay. The Germans, who had built their strategy around powerful but slow-to-produce tanks, found themselves outmatched in the long run by the relentless production capabilities of the United States. As the war neared its end, the consequences of this imbalance were clear. The Germans could no longer keep up with the Americans. The U.S. could field more tanks, more soldiers, and more supplies at a faster rate than Germany could ever hope to match. The Allies would continue to push forward, and the Sherman tank would play a key role in that push, a symbol of the power of mass production and logistics on the modern battlefield. The M4 Sherman tank was designed to be a reliable workhorse for the U.S. Army, built for mass production and ease of use. It wasn't meant to be the most powerful or most advanced tank on the battlefield, but it was made to get the job done. The design focused on versatility and the ability to produce tanks quickly, something the U.S. military needed in large numbers. Compared to the German tanks it faced, the Sherman was smaller, lighter, and less heavily armored. It carried a 75mm gun, which was smaller and less powerful than the 88mm gun mounted on the German Tiger I and Panther tanks. While the German tanks were larger, stronger, and better armed, the Sherman made up for its lack of firepower and armor with speed, reliability, and production capacity. The Germans, with their focus on creating heavy, specialized tanks, couldn't keep up with the pace of the Sherman's production. The Sherman's design made it easier to build, maintain, and repair, which made it a tank that could be mass-produced quickly, sometimes in the thousands. One of the key factors that made the Sherman such an effective weapon was its mechanical reliability. Unlike the more complex German tanks, which were prone to breakdowns and mechanical failures, the Sherman was designed to be easy to maintain and repair. The Germans, who often relied on highly specialized crews and equipment to repair their heavy tanks, found it difficult to keep their vehicles in working order during long campaigns. The Sherman, by contrast, could be repaired quickly in the field, allowing U.S. forces to keep their tanks in combat for longer periods. The Sherman's simple design also made it easier to produce. The U.S. Army needed thousands of tanks to support the D-Day invasion and the subsequent campaign across Europe. The Sherman was the answer. Factories across the United States shifted into full production mode, turning out tanks at an astounding rate. By the end of the war, over 50,000 Shermans had been built. This was a staggering number, especially when compared to the production of Germany's more specialized tanks. The Germans had spent a great deal of time and effort building fewer, more powerful tanks, but these were more difficult and expensive to produce. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be built faster at a lower cost and in greater numbers. While the Sherman tank was reliable and easy to build, it wasn't without its limitations. Its armor was thinner than that of the German tanks, making it more vulnerable to enemy fire. The 75mm gun, while capable, didn't have the punch of the German 88mm. In a one-on-one tank duel, the Sherman would often lose, as the German tanks could destroy the Sherman from a greater distance. But this was not the Sherman's strength. The strength of the Sherman was in numbers and reliability. The U.S. Army didn't expect the Sherman to be able to take on the German tanks in a direct fight. Instead, the tank's role was to support infantry, provide mobile firepower, and wear down the enemy over time. When facing the heavily armored German tanks, Sherman crews used tactics like flanking and attacking from the rear, where the armor was weaker. The Sherman was more mobile than the German tanks, which were slower and less maneuverable. The Americans relied on numbers, pushing forward with waves of Shermans, overwhelming German positions before the enemy could respond. The Sherman's design also allowed for different variants, including ones equipped with flamethrowers and bulldozer blades. These specialized versions of the Sherman tank were used in different combat scenarios, further proving the versatility of the design. In urban warfare, the Sherman with a flamethrower, known as the Zippo, could clear enemy positions in buildings. The Sherman with a bulldozer blade was used to clear roads, remove debris, and even dig defensive positions. These variants showed that the Sherman wasn't just a tank for direct combat. It could be adapted to meet the needs of different types of battle. The U.S. military learned quickly how to exploit the Sherman's strengths. While its armor and firepower were not on par with the German tanks, its ease of use made it ideal for mass combat. It was the tank the U.S. Army needed for its approach to warfare. The Sherman could be used in large numbers, could be repaired quickly in the field, and could be replaced without delay. When a Sherman was destroyed, another one was ready to take its place. This meant that the Americans could keep pressing the attack, while the Germans, with their more specialized tanks, couldn't replace their losses at the same rate. The Sherman's speed and mobility were also crucial in its effectiveness. In battle, the Sherman could keep up with infantry and other support vehicles, making it an excellent all-around tank. Its lighter weight meant that it could cross terrain that the larger German tanks could not. This gave the U.S. Army a tactical advantage in many situations, particularly in the bocage country of Normandy, where the ground was often muddy and difficult to navigate. While the Sherman's armor wasn't as thick as the German tanks, its sloped design offered some degree of protection. This design allowed shells to ricochet off the tank surface, reducing the likelihood of a direct hit. The Sherman's turret was also designed for ease of use. It allowed the crew to quickly reload and fire, even under pressure. This gave Sherman crews an edge in fast-moving engagements, where speed and accuracy were more important than raw firepower. Despite its shortcomings, the Sherman tank was one of the most effective weapons the Allies had at their disposal. It was not the most powerful tank, nor the most advanced, but it was reliable, easy to produce, and effective when used in large numbers. Its design allowed the U.S. to outproduce the Germans, flooding the battlefield with tanks the Germans couldn't hope to match. It was a tank built for war, and it did its job well. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the German High Command expected a tough fight. They were ready to face the American tanks, but they thought the numbers would be on their side. The Germans had built powerful tanks like the Tiger I and Panther, which were technically advanced and designed for decisive elite engagements. These tanks could knock out enemy armor at long range, and their thick armor could withstand hits from many smaller guns. The German strategy focused on using these heavy tanks to crush any threats in direct combat. They didn't expect to be overwhelmed by numbers. But when the fighting started, the Germans were shocked. The Americans weren't sending a few tanks into battle, they were sending hundreds. The M4 Sherman tank, with its smaller gun and thinner armor, wasn't as impressive as the German heavy tanks, but the sheer number of Shermans flooding the battlefield quickly became a problem. The Germans were used to facing smaller, more manageable numbers of enemy tanks. Now they had to contend with waves of Shermans, each one quickly replaced when destroyed. The German strategy focused on elite tanks was suddenly irrelevant. The Germans were outnumbered and outproduced. This new reality forced the German commanders to rethink their tactics. They tried using their heavy tanks in ambushes, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. They set up tank destroyers and tried to use the terrain to their advantage. But the Americans didn't play into these tactics. The U.S. forces had learned to advance in large formations, with infantry and air support to back up their tanks. Even when German tanks managed to take out one Sherman, another tank would quickly take its place, keeping up the pressure on the German lines. This constant replenishment of American tanks made it nearly impossible for the Germans to gain ground. The Germans also struggled with their own logistics. While they had built advanced tanks, they couldn't replace them as quickly as the Americans. When a German tank was knocked out, it could take days or weeks to repair, depending on the damage. On the other hand, the Americans could replace their Shermans almost immediately. The German tanks, with their superior firepower and armor, were often caught out of position or forced to retreat when they could no longer keep up with the American advance. The Germans had tried to use their superior tanks to hold off the Allies. The Tiger I and Panther tanks were capable of knocking out Shermans from a distance, but the sheer number of Shermans meant that the Germans had to keep fighting and destroying tanks, only to face more coming from the rear. The German tank crews quickly realized that they were no longer fighting a battle of skill and precision. They were facing a war of attrition. For every Sherman they destroyed, it seemed that two more would take its place. The German tanks, despite their technical superiority, were becoming less effective as they were worn down by the constant pressure of the Allied advance. This constant pressure forced the Germans into situations where they couldn't fight effectively. The German tanks, with their heavy armor and big guns, needed time to get into position and fire. The Sherman tanks, lighter and more mobile, could advance quickly, flanking German positions and forcing them into defensive stances. The Germans, despite having better tanks, could no longer engage in the kind of tank battles they were used to. Instead of using their firepower to destroy the enemy, they were now forced to retreat or wait for the Americans to make mistakes. The Germans had tried to use their tank destroyers to tip the scales in their favor. These vehicles, equipped with powerful anti-tank guns, were meant to be used as an ambush weapon. The idea was to pick off the American tanks from a distance, taking advantage of the terrain to hide and wait for the right moment. But the American tanks, in large numbers and well supported by infantry and artillery, were too much for the tank destroyers to handle. The Germans were caught in a defensive posture, unable to break the American advance. Meanwhile, the Americans continued their push forward, confident in the reliability of their tanks. The Sherman, though less powerful than the German tanks, was designed to work as part of a larger combined arms strategy. The Americans didn't just rely on their tanks. They used infantry, artillery, and air support to support their ground forces. When the Germans tried to ambush a Sherman, they often found that the American forces were already coordinating attacks from multiple directions. The sheer volume of firepower from all sides made it difficult for the Germans to counter effectively. As the fighting continued, the German forces began to feel the strain of facing such a relentless assault. The sheer number of Sherman tanks was beginning to tip the scales in favor of the Allies. The German heavy tanks, once feared for their firepower and armor, were now isolated in small pockets of resistance, unable to stand up to the overwhelming numbers of the American forces. The Tigers and Panthers, though still dangerous, couldn't change the tide of battle. The German forces were stretched thin, fighting to hold ground, while the Americans pressed forward, using their numbers to push the Germans back. At times, the Germans tried to mount counterattacks, but these efforts were quickly met by the flood of American tanks. The Sherman tank, while not as formidable on its own as the German heavy tanks, had an advantage in numbers and speed. German commanders found it difficult to focus their forces in one place long enough to achieve any kind of decisive victory. The U.S. tanks were always there, moving quickly to where the fighting was fiercest, and always supported by air and artillery. The Germans were caught in a difficult position. They had powerful tanks, but they couldn't match the numbers of the American Shermans. They had elite crews and advanced tactics, but these were no longer enough to overcome the sheer weight of American firepower. The German tank crews began to realize that they were being overwhelmed, not by superior tanks, but by an enemy that could afford to lose tanks and keep fighting. In the heat of battle, the tactical drama was clear. The Germans tried everything from ambushes to using their superior tanks to halt the American advance, but the overwhelming numbers of Shermans, along with the constant reinforcements, made it impossible for the Germans to keep up. The tactical balance had shifted, and the Germans were now in a losing fight of attrition. On the ground in Normandy, German soldiers were left stunned by the relentless wave of American Sherman tanks. At first, they believed they could handle the challenge. The German army had spent years refining their tactics and building powerful tanks like the Tiger I and Panther. These were tanks designed to dominate the battlefield, with thick armor and high-powered guns. They were supposed to be the answer to any Allied advance. But as the Allies pushed further into France, the German soldiers quickly realized that their tanks, no matter how formidable, were no match for the overwhelming numbers of Shermans. For the soldiers on the front lines, the frustration was clear. They would destroy one Sherman, only to see 2 or 3 more replace it. The Americans weren't fighting with a few tanks. They were fighting with an endless supply of tanks that kept arriving at a rapid pace. Each time a German tank knocked out a Sherman, another one seemed to appear from behind. The sense of disbelief grew as the hours turned to days. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, they couldn't stop the tide. There was no relief, no time to regroup, no chance to gain an advantage. The soldiers quickly learned that their superior tanks weren't enough. They could destroy Shermans, but they couldn't keep up with the constant flow of replacements. Each Sherman that fell was quickly replaced by another one coming from the rear. The German troops, once confident in their heavy tanks, now found themselves fighting a war of attrition they were not prepared for. As much as they tried to hold the line, the sheer volume of Allied tanks was too much. The German strategy, built around high-quality, elite tanks, was falling apart in the face of overwhelming numbers. German officers saw the need to change tactics. They shifted their focus to anti-tank weapons, hoping to give their soldiers a better chance to fight back. The Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank rocket, was introduced in an attempt to counter the American tanks. The idea was simple. The soldier would get close to the tank, aim for the weaker spots, and fire the weapon. It was a last-ditch effort to give the Germans a fighting chance. But while the Panzerfaust was effective in close-range combat, it couldn't change the fact that the Germans were still outnumbered. Even when they destroyed a Sherman, there were more coming. The shift to anti-tank weapons couldn't solve the fundamental problem of overwhelming American numbers. The Germans, despite their technological advantage in certain areas, simply didn't have enough tanks or resources to sustain their fight. On the other side of the battlefield, American soldiers saw things differently. They had confidence in the strength of their tanks, not because the Shermans were better than the German tanks, but because they had numbers on their side. The overwhelming quantity of Shermans gave the American forces a sense of optimism. For every Sherman that was destroyed, another was on its way. The U.S. Army was designed for rapid replacement and repair. Unlike the German tanks, which took days or even weeks to repair, the Sherman could be fixed quickly in the field. When a Sherman was knocked out, it wasn't the end. It was simply a temporary setback. The soldiers could count on their tanks being replaced faster than the Germans could destroy them. This quick turnover of tanks gave the Americans a psychological edge. They didn't fear losing tanks because they knew they could keep replacing them. The constant presence of Shermans on the battlefield, always moving forward, gave the American soldiers a sense of unstoppable momentum. The Germans, in contrast, faced the brutal reality of having to fight against an enemy that could afford to lose tanks and still keep coming. For both sides, the destruction of tanks meant loss of life. Each tank that was destroyed represented not just a vehicle but a crew of men. For the Germans, their losses were heavy, and as the war went on, their replacements became fewer and farther between. The German soldiers fought with determination, but many of them began to see the writing on the wall. They had fewer tanks, fewer men, and fewer resources to continue the fight. Each destroyed Sherman tank cost the Americans, but they could always replace them. On the other hand, each lost German tank was a significant blow. They couldn't replace their tanks as quickly as the Americans, and the loss of a tank often meant the loss of a crew, something that would take much longer to replace. The human cost was high on both sides. For the Americans, losing a Sherman tank was an expensive setback, but it didn't stop the momentum. For the Germans, every lost tank and crew member was a step closer to defeat. German soldiers had to cope with the reality that their once formidable tanks were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For them, it was a constant battle of trying to hold off an enemy they couldn't stop. The Americans, though facing losses of their own, had the advantage of being able to replace their tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. As the battle raged on, the frustration among German soldiers grew. They had fought for months, using every tactic they could think of to try to stop the Allies. But no matter what they did, the Americans kept coming. They kept bringing tanks. They kept pressing forward. The Germans could not keep up with the flow of Shermans. The German officers could issue orders, but it was clear that they couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy that had the resources to outlast them. The soldiers had done everything they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. For the Americans, the war seemed like a series of victories. They had the numbers, the tanks, and the logistics to keep up their advance. Each time they lost a tank, another would replace it. Each time a crew was lost, another crew was ready to take their place. The optimism grew as they saw the effectiveness of their strategy. The Germans couldn't stop them. The sheer number of Shermans and the support systems in place ensured that the Americans would continue pushing forward. The human cost for both sides was high, but the American ability to replace their tanks gave them a crucial advantage. The Germans, with their limited resources and dwindling manpower, found themselves in a difficult position. For the American soldiers, the war was a challenge, but it was a challenge they were built to overcome. They had the tanks, they had the men, and they had the strategy to keep moving forward. The Germans, on the other hand, had the tanks, but not enough to stop the American tide. They were fighting a battle of attrition they could never win. For the Germans, the situation in Normandy and the rest of Western Europe was rapidly deteriorating. The German military had always prided itself on its superior tanks, like the Tiger I and Panther, which were heavily armored and armed with powerful guns. These tanks were designed for decisive engagements, meant to break through enemy lines and hold key positions. But as the Allies advanced, the Germans began to realize that their elite tanks were no longer enough. They were simply outnumbered. The Germans faced a critical issue. They couldn't keep up with the pace of tank production. While they focused on building fewer, more advanced tanks, the Americans were building Shermans by the thousands. The German economy, already strained by years of war, couldn't match the industrial output of the United States. The Germans relied on skilled crews and high-quality tanks to win battles. But when those tanks were destroyed, replacements were not coming fast enough. The U.S. Army, on the other hand, could lose a tank and replace it almost immediately. This difference in production capacity began to show in the field. As the Allies continued to push forward, the Germans were forced into a defensive position. The once feared Tiger and Panther tanks, which had been built for precision and power, were now fighting in a war of attrition. For every German tank that destroyed a Sherman, another Sherman would take its place. The German strategy of relying on fewer, more powerful tanks began to falter. They couldn't replace their losses fast enough, and their tanks, no matter how advanced, were becoming less effective in the face of overwhelming numbers. The Germans tried to hold on, using their elite tanks and relying on tactical ambushes and anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust. But these efforts were not enough. The Americans were too well coordinated, with large numbers of tanks, infantry, and air support working together. The Germans found themselves outmanned and outgunned, unable to stop the relentless American advance. The once formidable German tanks were now at risk of being surrounded and destroyed by the overwhelming numbers of Shermans. The U.S. Army, on the other hand, had found a way to turn the tide in their favor. The mass production of the Sherman tank became a game-changer for the Allies. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but it didn't need to be. It was reliable, easy to repair, and, most importantly, easy to replace. The American industrial base was able to produce tanks at a rate that the Germans simply couldn't match. While the Germans struggled to replace their elite tanks, the Americans were flooding the battlefield with Shermans. This constant supply of tanks was a major factor in the Allied success. The Sherman tanks were also a morale booster for the American troops. The soldiers knew that even if a Sherman was destroyed, it would be replaced quickly. This gave them confidence on the battlefield. They could continue to push forward, knowing that their tanks would be repaired or replaced without delay. The constant presence of Shermans on the battlefield allowed the Allies to maintain momentum, pushing the Germans further back across Europe. The U.S. Army's success was not just due to numbers. It was also about logistics and support. While the Sherman tank itself was not always the most powerful weapon on the battlefield, the U.S. Army had built a support infrastructure that allowed their forces to keep fighting. The Shermans were easier to repair than the German tanks, and the supply lines for spare parts and fuel were well established. The Germans, in contrast, faced constant logistical challenges. Their tanks were harder to maintain, and the supplies needed to keep them running were often in short supply. The Allied advantage in logistics was a key factor in the success of the Sherman tank. The ability to maintain a steady supply of tanks and equipment allowed the Americans to adapt quickly to battlefield conditions. Early in the war, the Sherman faced technical issues, including problems with its engine and transmission. But the U.S. Army worked quickly to address these problems. As the Allies moved through France and into Germany, the American forces adapted their tactics and equipment to meet the changing needs of the battlefield. The Sherman, though not perfect, was a tank that could be repaired, maintained, and replaced in large numbers. This ability to keep the tanks running, along with the sheer volume of Shermans, gave the Allies a decisive edge. As the war continued, the Germans faced a growing sense of despair. Their tanks, once the pride of their military, were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of American tanks. They couldn't keep up with the pace of production, and their logistical problems only worsened. The strategy of relying on fewer, more powerful tanks had worked for a time, but it was no longer enough. The Allies had the advantage in numbers, logistics, and support, and the German tanks were no match for the constant flow of Shermans. For the Americans, the success of the Sherman tank was a result of careful planning and effective use of resources. The mass production of the Sherman allowed the Allies to keep pressing the attack, even when they faced setbacks. The U.S. Army's focus on logistics and support meant that they could keep their tanks in the fight longer than the Germans. As the Allies advanced across Europe, they knew that their tanks would continue to arrive, ready to replace those that were lost. This constant reinforcement, combined with the strength of the Sherman tank, helped tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies. In the end, the mass production of the Sherman tank played a key role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The German military, despite its technological advantages in certain areas, simply couldn't match the overwhelming numbers and logistical power of the United States. The Sherman tank, though not the most advanced or powerful, became a symbol of the American ability to outproduce and outlast their enemies. The strategic consequences were clear. The Germans had lost the ability to keep up with the pace of war, while the Americans continued to advance, backed by the relentless production of tanks. After the war ended, the Sherman tank became a symbol of American industrial might. It wasn't the most advanced tank on the battlefield, nor the most powerful, but its role in World War II was undeniable. The Sherman showed that mass production could change the course of a war, even when the product itself wasn't the best in terms of firepower or armor. The German military, which had focused on building tanks like the Tiger I and Panther, now understood the limitations of relying on elite, highly advanced machines. While the German tanks were strong and well-armed, they were fewer in number and harder to replace. The Sherman, on the other hand, was built in massive quantities, making it a critical asset in the Allied victory. The Germans' focus on quality over quantity had worked for a time. The Tiger I and Panther tanks were formidable opponents, capable of destroying enemy tanks at long range and with great efficiency. However, as the war dragged on, the Germans were unable to keep up with the Allies' production capacity. The Germans could no longer build enough of their advanced tanks to compete with the sheer number of American Shermans. They faced an overwhelming quantity of enemy tanks, and it was this imbalance that ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The post-war reflection on the Sherman's success showed a crucial lesson in military strategy. Quantity, combined with effective logistics, could often overcome quality. The Sherman tank exemplified this lesson. The United States was able to produce it quickly, repair it in the field, and replace it without delay. This mass production approach gave the Allies a sustained presence on the battlefield, something the Germans could not match. The Sherman tank, with its relatively simple design, proved that large-scale production and logistics were just as important, if not more so, than the technical specifications of a weapon. The legacy of the Sherman tank didn't stop with World War II. In modern military strategy, the lessons of the Sherman's success continue to influence how armies think about resource allocation, logistics, and the importance of supply chains. Military planners today understand that a well-supported army, capable of maintaining and replenishing its forces, has a significant advantage over an army relying on fewer, but more powerful units. The U.S. military's ability to produce large numbers of tanks, ships, and aircraft during World War II set a precedent for future conflicts. The Sherman also taught the importance of adaptability. Early in the war, the Sherman had technical issues that made it less reliable than the German tanks. However, the U.S. military adapted, improving the tank's design and solving many of the problems. The ability to adjust and improve equipment in the field, combined with the capacity for mass production, made the Sherman a reliable workhorse. This flexibility in both equipment and tactics allowed the U.S. to maintain momentum throughout the war. Another key lesson was the power of logistical superiority. The Sherman's success was not just because it was a decent tank, but because it was backed by an efficient supply chain. The U.S. could deliver replacement parts and new tanks quickly, allowing their forces to stay in action longer. German tanks, in contrast, were more difficult to repair and had longer downtimes, giving the Allies the upper hand. The ability to keep tanks running and replace lost ones gave the U.S. a decisive edge, one that the Germans could never match. The overwhelming numbers of Sherman tanks, combined with the ability to repair and replace them, forced the Germans into a difficult position. They were constantly outnumbered, and their inability to replace lost tanks at the same rate as the Americans led to their eventual defeat. The Germans' reliance on their superior tanks, without the support systems in place to sustain them, ultimately proved to be a fatal flaw in their strategy. In modern warfare, the importance of logistics and mass production remains as relevant as ever. While advanced technology and superior weapons are important, armies that can maintain their forces, adapt to changing circumstances, and supply their troops with what they need to keep fighting have a significant advantage. The Sherman tank's legacy is a reminder that military power is not just about building the most advanced weapons, but about ensuring that those weapons can be produced, repaired, and replaced in the face of sustained conflict. The story of the Sherman tank teaches military leaders to think beyond individual weapon superiority. It highlights the importance of having a strategy that includes logistics, production, and adaptability. As armies today continue to develop new technologies and weapon systems, the lessons learned from the Sherman tank remain valuable, shaping the way modern militaries approach combat and strategy.